Glass, a third installment in M. Night Shyamalan's Israel 177 trilogy, was already made a subject of a lot of videos on YouTube. But I can't help but notice a few aspects that make that movie what it is hardly being discussed. As an important side note, I love all three movies in the trilogy, and I was not disappointed with Glass. It fulfills my very specific need for superhero movies which hit closer to home than usual. I find it quite odd that movies like that are what we essentially call unusual, because mainstream superhero entries tend to become increasingly outlandish and detached, until general appeal of that genre is virtually lost. Well, at least in my humble case. So I decided that, instead of defending a specific case of Israel 177, I'd rather try and explain what it did that many other contemporary superhero movies didn't. Such an explanation will require us to come back to origins of superhero genre, which are a bit diverse. On one hand, we have legendary heroes from mythologies all over the world. Hercules or Heracles, Gilgamesh, and King David are a few examples, and there are villains like Goliath too. However, on the other hand, forming of structural elements which make for a modern superhero fiction began with early commercialization of literature in the 19th century. Several figures that make good examples are Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll/Mr. Hyde. For the sake of simplicity, let's take Sherlock Holmes as our example of prototype superhero. A detective so brilliant, his skills exceed crime-fighting capabilities of the police. An exceptional, if not supernatural, human being who becomes people's main hope and asset in equally baffling and exceptional cases. Odd to the formula, peak human stamina and agility for someone his age, an overly excited psychic, and the colorful rogues gallery, led by an archenemy. Someone whose exceptionality, equal to that of a hero, is only rivaled by how opposite his moral compass is to that of Holmes. Even though world's most brilliant detective will be the first one to admit that laws are far from perfect, and break a few here and there if he sees fit for situation. Holmes, in universe and even out of it, was a beacon of hope, someone who was willing to help an aristocrat and homeless hobo alike. He had a very flamboyant and unusual taste in clothes, often being depicted wearing a cape and an odd piece of headwear, and also had a very relatable human weakness of being addicted to several substances, including tobacco and cocaine. It won't be far of a stretch to say that Holmes was a character who made crime fighting a natural area of superheroes' expertise. The need of making wrong right and restraining both street and master level of crime was on the rise in the end of 19th century, as people gradually became aware that society's development had a side effect of crime developing as well, becoming organized and much more evident in urban areas. Holmes, both in universe and on pages of Conan Doyle's writing, was active until 1920s, kicking a new era of so-called pulp literature. Usually serialized in cheap magazines rather than expensive hardcover books, it provided hungry readers with more far-fetched superheroes and supervillains, such as Tarzan, Zorro, Fantomas, and several others. Next important steps occurred in 1930s. The Shadow was the first superhero to majorly occupy several types of media at the same time, namely hugely successful radio plays, pulp magazines, and movies. Very odd movies, by the way. Depending on variant, Shadow either had supernatural abilities or replicated ones with technology, experience, and exceptional skills. In any case, he lived by his motto: who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. The idea of a superhero not just willing to take down crime, but knowing it well enough to take precautious steps here and there, excited and inspired people, while marketing strategy of pulp revitalized industries of comic books and comic strips. By the end of 1930s, strips were able to modernize exceptional detective template of Sherlock Holmes into Dick Tracy, whose rogues gallery somehow managed to be both grounded and based on real-life examples, and excitingly outlandish in their gimmicks and visual appearance. Comic books took idea several steps further, introducing Superman and Batman, both of them stretching the idea of exceptional hero to new heights, a supernatural being that can fight crime and prevent disasters, being equally eager to do both, and a severely traumatized normal human being who mastered many skills for that specific purpose. As retrospective already took too long, without further ado, we can jump to how Unbreakable took the far-fetched comic book concepts back to reality. We have a story in which a man discovers that he is impenetrable after surviving a disastrous event. With the help of a few strategically placed messages from an opposite of his, a comic book fan whose bones break twice as easy as those of ordinary human being, he discovers that he also has increased strengths and a sense that literally makes him able to see people's sins and know what evil lurks in their hearts. He also discovers that he has a specific weakness. For the first time, he decides to use the train station as a public place to detect a crime that he can't stop, one immediate enough to save someone. Unbreakable was one of the first movies that actually made me think what makes me fascinated with superhero genre. Themes of sacrifice, knowing one's place in the world, believing in yourself, and trying to make the world a better place despite knowing it can't be perfect and never will. Themes of villains being just as important for history as heroes. Split took that idea and rolled with it, showing how world will look from the perspective of severely unstable supernatural being, as well as one's victims. An often overlooked concept that we tend to see more often today, with Netflix's Jessica Jones featuring a plot point of a support group for victims of a specific supervillain. Essentially, Split allows for an effective demonstration that slasher film, a subgenre of horror, is basically a supervillain movie with, usually, no sufficient superheroes in it to oppose the threat. An interesting moment in Unbreakable specifies two types of supervillain: soldier and mastermind. Exceptional killers from slasher movies usually fall into one or another category out of those two, and in some movies the twist is that there are two killers, one planner and one of a more immediate, action-prone kind, capable of feats of physical excellence. Split uses several tropes of a slow-burn slasher film, especially in the third act, a reversal of sorts of a classic proto-slasher about split personality, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, to which there are surprisingly a lot of references in both Split and Glass. Glass makes use of all aforementioned tropes and elements to make a point of how our modern world can be improved. I think I won't be the only one with an idea that at this point the only thing that prevents real-life superheroes from becoming as prominent as fictional ones is our severe lack of self-belief. People are prone to doubt themselves, and they're naturally projecting that doubt to humanity as a whole. Whole trilogy could be classified as a superhero noir. Film noir and neo-noir usually happen to be gritty and dark, with doubt as a central theme, but also quite stylized to the point that it's quite possible to trace certain elements of both noir and comics to German Expressionism. Just as comic books, Expressionism tended to have fantastic, over-the-top villains with unique facial features, exactly the kind both James McAvoy and Samuel L. Jackson portray in his Trail 177 trilogy. However, one element, that of character color scheme, is almost indigenous to comics. Almost, because Alfred Hitchcock's transition from black and white to color went uncanny well, with new element put to immediate and effective use. M. Night Shyamalan was inspired by both Hitchcock and comics, but his use of color contains another surprising element, a religious and even spiritual one. As one YouTube commentator suggested, color schemes of three main characters represent chakras. Adding more religious elements to a comic book movie seems to be a mildly popular instrument of deconstruction, instigating much deeper feelings in us than what we traditionally expect from reassuring and lightweight superhero fiction. Sam Raimi used Christian symbolism in his superhero movies, including Darkman, Evil Dead 2, and Spider-Man 2, all of which feature allusions to crucifixion. Paul Verhoeven's Robocop has religious symbolism as well, including titular character walking on water in one scene. And then there's Zack Snyder, whom, using religious elements in his superhero movies, is pretty much a trademark. Themes of belief and doubt were there since the period of mythological mitosis. Religious imagery make for great visual storytelling devices because they are deeply rooted in traditions, and subconsciously, even as mild uses as color schemes might work. It is rather easy to perceive monk-like vibes from how the Horde and Beast look like, although chakras are an Hinduist concept, while McAvoy's character looks more like a Buddhist monk. That is interesting in its own regard, because M. Night Shyamalan's approach to filmmaking is as philosophical as is his approach to subject. As he put in his Twitter, "Cinema has always been sacred to me, my religion in many ways. To be able to add my voice in the mix." He also notes in another tweet, as the character's belief in the comic book world, the primary colors become more dominant. As they stop believing, they fade into monochromatic world. Details like that, intentional and thematic, made Glass a great movie in my book. I like when details in the movie lead to personal discoveries, and it seems that even song placing in Glass was quite specific, as lyrics of the song were changing by small LA band Corners, which is heard in one of the comic book shop scenes, mirrors the plot of the movie, or at least have more than a passing resemblance. I'm not as sure about another discovery of mine though. It seems that beginning of the film bears some resemblance to a Batman's arc, which ran for 2 issues in Detective Comics number 586 and 587. Just as we witness in Glass, a superhero, in this case Batman, faces off more down-to-earth villains than usual, a duo of petty criminals, one of which randomly attacks people in the streets and another one films that. Despite some details aligning oddly specific, such as the tough guy of the duo being defeated by slamming against the wall, I don't think that the scenes in Glass were plagiarized from Detective Comics. More so, they work as an antithesis of sorts, as in the comic, villains do that to supply a larger benefactor with material for his private screenings, while in the movie, 2 guys upload their misdeeds on the internet, making us, the ever-curious crowd, such benefactor. Detective Comics, number 587, end up in Batman wondering about an unending cycle of violence, which he is not able to stop, only partially help to slow down. An interesting moment considering it happened in the beginning of the year, which saw Batman return to both big screen and more violent ways, as Tim Burton's Batman was the first incarnation of character to kill people since, arguably, his earliest appearances in late 1930s. I can safely say that ending of Glass was much more inspiring and wholesome, than that of Detective Comics number 587. I view the similarities as a part of a 30-year cycle of popular culture, which actually might suggest that we finally begin to understand why we love seeing superheroes so much, but mostly reject the idea of having them in our society. Could it be that, like Batman of 1989, we're almost ready to give up because we know that violence is an unending cycle? May it be that actually living in that cycle of violence makes us not noticing it and thinking that problem gone away? Quoting one song that asks where Superman is now when everything gone wrong somehow. Did you read the news today? They say the danger's gone away. But what if danger is always there? And what superhero genre is trying to say is that it can be eliminated, but can't be conquered. Am I reading too much in the comics, songs and movies? I might be, but that's because I want to embrace quality in them and use the knowledge and experience taken from discussion and analysis to be better at creating my own quality content.
How much for this one?